Hi, 28F. Just found out today my dad sexually abused and raped my sisters when they were little. I'm not sure where to begin as I think I'm still in literal shock. I was at my mother's house today when she and one of my half-sisters decided to pull me aside and tell me something that has completely upended my world. My family has always been complicated. My parents divorced when I was young and my father remarried, becoming a stepfather to my two half-sisters. Growing up, I spent time between both households, but was always closest with my dad. He was a great father to me and we had a special bond. At least that's what I thought until today. With trembling voices and tear-filled eyes, my mother and sister revealed a horrific truth they had kept hidden for decades. They told me that my father, the man I looked up to and admired, had sexually abused both of my half-sisters when they were children. The abuse started when the youngest was only 4 or 5 years old, and continued for years right under everyone's noses. I sat there in stunned silence as they recounted the painful details, the devastating impact it had on both of my sisters' lives. The oldest, now 35, has struggled with drug addiction and instability since her early teenage years. The younger sister, 32, also had a tumultuous adolescence but has since built a stable life for herself. As I listened, my mind reeled with a barrage of emotions. Shock, disgust, anger, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. How could my father, the man who was supposed to protect and love his family, commit such heinous acts against innocent children? Against my own sisters? My mother explained that she had no idea about the abuse until my oldest sister confided in her at age 13 or 14. As soon as she found out, she immediately kicked my father out and filed for divorce. But what she revealed next made my stomach churn even more. Despite knowing the truth, my mother never reported my father to the police. My sisters, grappling with their own trauma and fear, said they would deny everything if she went to the authorities. I can't begin to imagine the weight of that decision on my mother's shoulders. Instead, my grandfather took matters into his own hands. He showed up at my father's door with a shotgun, intent on making him pay for what he had done. But somehow my father managed to escape unscathed. Shortly after, he fled the country and took a job overseas, working in Iraq for years until a recent stroke forced him to return home. As I sat there trying to process this avalanche of information, I felt my world crumbling around me. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my own childhood, was suddenly called into question. How could I reconcile the loving father I remembered with the monster they were describing? But the revelation that shattered me the most was learning that my own children, my precious daughter and sons, had been around this man countless times since his return. The thought of what could have happened, of the potential danger I had unknowingly exposed them to, made me physically ill. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I knew was that my life had been irrevocably changed in the span of a single conversation, and I had no idea where to go from here. As I sat there, trying to process the bombshell my mother and sister had just dropped, I felt my world spinning out of control. The revelation of my father's sexual abuse towards my half-sisters hit me like a ton of bricks, and I struggled to wrap my mind around the horrifying truth. My mother's voice wavered as she recounted the moment my oldest sister confided in her about the abuse. She described the look of anguish and fear in my sister's eyes as she revealed the unspeakable acts our father had committed against her and our younger sister. The details were sickening, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I listened. How could my father, the man who had always been a loving and supportive presence in my life, be capable of such monstrous behavior? I tried to reconcile the image of the gentle, caring dad I remembered with the predator they were describing, but it was impossible. The two versions of him couldn't coexist in my mind. As my mother spoke, I could see the pain etched on her face. The guilt she carried for not realizing what was happening under her own roof, for not being able to protect her daughters from the unimaginable trauma they endured. My heart broke for her, for the burden she had carried alone for so long. My sister, her eyes brimming with tears, described the years of abuse she and our younger sister had suffered in silence. The fear, the shame, the confusion that had plagued them throughout their childhood and adolescence. She spoke of the countless nights she lay awake, praying for the nightmare to end, and the days she spent trying to navigate the world with the weight of this secret crushing her soul. I listened, my own tears flowing freely, as she recounted the moment she finally found the courage to speak out. The terror she felt in confiding in our mother, the fear of not being believed or of tearing our family apart. But even in the face of such unimaginable pain, my sister's strength shone through. She had survived, she had persevered, and now she was breaking the silence to protect others. As the truth sank in, I felt a surge of anger towards my father. How could he have betrayed his own children, his own family, in such a vile and despicable way? How could he have shattered the trust and innocence of two little girls who looked up to him, who relied on him for love and protection? But even as the rage boiled inside me, I also felt a profound sense of guilt. Guilt for not seeing the signs, for not being there to protect my sisters when they needed me most. Guilt for the times I had laughed and played with my father, oblivious to the darkness that lurked beneath his charming exterior. I sat there, my mind reeling, as my mother and sister continued to speak. They told me of the years of therapy, the struggles with addiction and self-destructive behavior, the long and painful road to healing they had both embarked upon. And through it all, they had carried this secret, this unimaginable burden, alone. As the conversation drew to a close, I felt a sense of both relief and dread wash over me. Relief that the truth was finally out in the open, that my sisters no longer had to suffer in silence. But dread for the long and difficult journey that lay ahead, for the impact this revelation would have on every aspect of our lives. I hugged my mother and sister tightly, promising them that I would be there for them every step of the way, that we would face this together as a family, no matter how painful or difficult it might be. And as I walked out of my mother's house that day, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. In the days and weeks that followed the revelation, I found myself consumed by thoughts of my sisters and the devastating impact my father's abuse had on their lives. As I grappled with my own emotions, I couldn't begin to fathom the depth of their pain and the long-lasting scars they carried. My oldest sister, now 35, had been the one to bear the brunt of the abuse. She was just a little girl when it started, barely old enough to understand the gravity of what was happening to her. As she grew older, the trauma manifested itself in countless destructive ways. She turned to drugs as a means of escape, seeking solace in the temporary oblivion they provided. Her life spiraled out of control as addiction took hold, dragging her down a path of self-destruction and despair. She struggled to maintain relationships, to hold down a job, to find any semblance of stability or happiness. I thought back to the times I had seen her over the years, the glimpses of pain and turmoil behind her eyes that I had never fully understood. Now, with the truth laid bare, I saw those moments in a new light. The erratic behavior, the angry outbursts, the periods of withdrawal and isolation. All of it made sense in the context of the unimaginable trauma she had endured. My younger sister, though not subjected to the same level of abuse, had also suffered immensely. She was just a child when it began, too young to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal she was experiencing. As she entered her teenage years, the weight of the secret she carried manifested in rebellious and self-destructive behavior. She struggled in school, often skipping classes and getting into trouble with authorities. She engaged in risky behavior, seeking out dangerous situations as if tempting fate to intervene. There were times when we feared for her safety, when we wondered if she would make it through the tumultuous years of adolescence. But somehow, against all odds, she found the strength to turn her life around. She sought help, went to therapy, and slowly began to piece together the shattered fragments of her identity. She met a man who loved and supported her, who helped her see her own worth and potential. Together, they built a life of stability and purpose, one step at a time. As I reflected on my sister's journeys, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for their resilience and courage. They had endured the unimaginable, had carried the weight of such profound trauma, and yet they had found a way to keep going, to keep fighting for a better future. But even as I marveled at their strength, I couldn't ignore the anger and betrayal I felt towards my mother. When she first learned of the abuse, she had made the decision to divorce my father, to kick him out of our lives for good. But she had stopped short of reporting him to the authorities, of seeking justice for the heinous crimes he had committed. I understood her reasoning, the fear of putting her daughters through the trauma of a public trial, the uncertainty of whether they would be believed or supported by a system that too often failed victims of abuse. But a part of me couldn't help but wonder if things might have been different if she had taken that step, if my father had been held accountable for his actions. As I grappled with these conflicting emotions, I knew that there was no easy answer, no clear path forward. All I could do was be there for my sisters, to support them in whatever way they needed, and to work towards building a future where no child would ever have to endure the horrors they had faced. It was a daunting task, but one I knew I had to undertake, for their sake and for the sake of countless others who suffered in silence. As I delved deeper into the painful history of my family, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of frustration and anger towards my mother. While I understood the impossible situation she had found herself in, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed my sisters by not reporting the abuse to the authorities. When my oldest sister had first confided in her, my mother had been faced with an agonizing choice. On one hand, she knew that going to the police was the right thing to do, that my father needed to be held accountable for his heinous crimes. But on the other hand, she was terrified of putting her daughters through the trauma of a public trial, of subjecting them to the scrutiny and judgment of a system that too often failed victims of abuse. In the end, she had chosen to protect her daughters in the only way she knew how, by keeping the abuse a secret and cutting my father out of our lives. She had filed for divorce, had made sure that he would never be able to hurt them again. But in doing so, she had also denied my sisters the opportunity for true justice, for the validation and closure that could only come from seeing their abuser face the consequences of his actions. I couldn't imagine the weight of that decision, the guilt and self-doubt that must have plagued her every day since. But as I grappled with my own emotions, I couldn't help but wonder if there could have been another way, if there was something more she could have done to support my sisters and hold my father accountable. Adding to the complexity of the situation was my sister's own reluctance to cooperate with the authorities. When my mother had first broached the subject of going to the police, They had both adamantly refused, threatening to deny everything if she pursued legal action. I could only imagine the fear and confusion they must have felt, the shame and self-blame that so often accompanies experiences of abuse. They had already endured so much trauma, had already had their lives shattered by the actions of a man they had trusted and loved. The thought of reliving those experiences in front of strangers, of being questioned and doubted and judged, must have been too much to bear. But even as I tried to understand their perspective, I couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration at the way their silence had allowed my father to escape accountability. If they had been willing to come forward, to testify against him and share their stories, perhaps he would have been brought to justice. Perhaps other children would have been spared the same fate. Of course, I knew that it was never that simple. Trauma affects everyone differently, and there is no one right way to heal or to seek justice. My sisters had each found their own path forward, had each fought their own battles and emerged stronger and more resilient than ever before. But even as I grappled with my own conflicting emotions, I couldn't ignore the anger and betrayal that my grandfather had felt when he learned of the abuse. According to my mother, he had been so enraged that he had grabbed his shotgun and gone to confront my father, intent on making him pay for what he had done. I could only imagine the scene that must have unfolded, the shouting and the threats and the fear that must have hung thick in the air. In the end, my father had managed to escape unscathed, had fled the country and disappeared into the shadows. But the knowledge that my grandfather had been willing to take matters into his own hands, to seek justice outside of the legal system, only added to the sense of chaos and upheaval that surrounded the entire situation. As I sat with my mother and listened to her recount those painful memories, I could see the toll they had taken on her over the years. The guilt, the self-doubt, the constant questioning of whether she had done enough, whether she had made the right choices. I reached out and took her hand, offering what little comfort I could in the face of such unimaginable pain. In the aftermath of my grandfather's confrontation with my father, the man who had once been the center of our family disappeared from our lives almost entirely. With the threat of violence hanging over his head and the weight of his crimes bearing down on him, he made the decision to flee the country, leaving behind the wreckage of the lives he had destroyed. For years, he worked overseas in Iraq, putting as much distance between himself and the consequences of his actions as possible. The nature of his work was always shrouded in secrecy, and I couldn't help but wonder if he had chosen that path as a way to escape the judgment and condemnation he knew he deserved. During that time, my contact with him was limited to the occasional phone call or email, always brief and superficial. We never spoke of the past, never acknowledged the elephant in the room that had torn our family apart. It was as if we were both content to pretend that everything was normal, that he was just a father working abroad to support his family. But even in those fleeting moments of contact, I could sense the distance between us, the unspoken barrier that had been erected by the terrible secrets we both carried. I found myself questioning every interaction, every word he spoke, searching for signs of the monster that lurked beneath the surface. As the years passed, I tried to move on with my life, to build a future for myself that wasn't defined by the traumas of my past. I met a wonderful man, got married, and started a family of my own. But even as I poured my heart and soul into creating a safe and loving home for my children, I couldn't shake the fear that my father's legacy would somehow find a way to taint even the most innocent and pure parts of my life. And then, just when I thought I had finally found some measure of peace and stability, my father suffered a mild stroke that forced him to return to the States. Suddenly, the man who had once been a distant memory was back in our lives, a physical presence that could no longer be ignored or pushed aside. I remember the first time I saw him after his return, the shock and revulsion that washed over me as I took in the sight of his face. He looked older, more frail than I remembered, but there was no mistaking the eyes that had once looked upon me with such love and affection, the same eyes that had gazed upon my sisters with such sick and twisted desire. I struggled to reconcile the conflicting emotions that warred within me, the love and longing for the father I had once known, and the disgust and betrayal I felt towards the monster he had proven himself to be. I knew that I could never truly forgive him for what he had done, but a part of me still yearned for the closure and understanding that only he could provide. In the weeks and months that followed, I found myself grappling with the painful decision of whether or not to allow him back into my life, even in a limited capacity. On one hand, I knew that I had to protect my children at all costs, to shield them from the darkness that had once consumed my own childhood. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to confront my father, to look him in the eye and demand answers for the unspeakable crimes he had committed. As I navigated the treacherous waters of this new reality, I leaned heavily on the support of my husband and my sisters, drawing strength from their love and understanding. Together, we made the decision to keep my father at a distance, to limit his access to our lives and our children as much as possible. But even as we set those boundaries, I knew that the scars of the past would never truly heal, that the wounds inflicted by my father's betrayal would always be a part of me. All I could do was keep moving forward, one day at a time, and hope that someday I would find a way to make peace with the pain that had shaped so much of my life. One of the most difficult aspects of my father's return was the realization that my own children had been exposed to him without my knowledge or consent. The thought that he had been in the same room as my precious little ones, that he had looked upon them with the same eyes that had once preyed upon my sisters, filled me with a terror and rage that I could hardly contain. My son, only 11 years old, had always been a curious and trusting child, eager to learn about the world around him. And my daughter, just 6, was the light of my life, a bundle of energy and joy that never failed to bring a smile to my face. The idea that they had been in the presence of a man capable of such unspeakable evil was almost too much for me to bear. But it wasn't just my own children who had been put at risk. My 12-year-old niece, who had been living with us since her mother, my sister, had fallen on hard times, had also been around my father on numerous occasions. The knowledge that she too had been exposed to the same danger as my own children only added to the weight of guilt and responsibility that pressed down on me from all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed them, that I hadn't done enough to protect them from the darkness that had once consumed my own childhood. I had always been so careful, so vigilant in my efforts to create a safe and loving home for my family. The fact that my father had managed to slip past my defenses, to worm his way into their lives without my knowledge or consent, felt like the ultimate betrayal. When I confronted my mother about the situation, she revealed that she had been keeping a close eye on my father's interactions with the children, that she had made it clear to him in no uncertain terms that he was to stay away from them at all costs. She had even gone so far as to threaten him, telling him that if he so much as looked at them the wrong way, she would not hesitate to turn him in to the authorities and make sure that he paid for his crimes. But even with my mother's assurances, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me like a dark cloud. I knew that my father was a master manipulator, that he had a way of twisting the truth and bending reality to his will. What if he had found a way to get to my children when my mother wasn't looking? What if he had already begun to lay the groundwork for the same kind of abuse that had shattered my sisters' lives? The thought was too horrifying to contemplate, but I knew that I couldn't afford to take any chances. From that moment on, I made the decision to cut my father out of our lives completely, to sever all ties with him, and make it clear that he was no longer welcome in our home or in our hearts. It was a painful decision, one that went against every instinct I had as a daughter and a sister. But I knew that it was the only way to keep my children safe, to protect them from the monster that lurked beneath my father's seemingly benign exterior. In the weeks and months that followed, I watched my children closely, looking for any signs that they had been affected by their exposure to my father. I talked to them openly and honestly about the importance of boundaries and consent, about the need to speak up if anyone ever made them feel uncomfortable or afraid. And slowly, day by day, I began to feel the weight of fear and guilt lifting from my shoulders. I knew that I could never undo the damage that had been done, that the scars of my family's past would always be a part of us. But I also knew that I had the power to shape my children's future, to give them the love and protection that had been so cruelly denied to my sisters and me. As I held my little ones close and whispered words of love and reassurance into their ears, I made a silent promise to myself and to them. I would do everything in my power to keep them safe, to give them the childhood that I had never had, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the strength and courage that my sisters had shown me, the unshakable belief that we could overcome anything as long as we had each other. As I grappled with the harsh realities of my father's return and the devastating impact it had on my family, I found myself consumed by a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The shock and disbelief that had initially overwhelmed me upon learning of his heinous crimes had given way to a deep and pervasive sense of fear, guilt, and anger that threatened to swallow me whole. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there were parts of my own childhood, dark and twisted memories that had been buried deep within the recesses of my mind, that were now stirring to life in the wake of my father's return. I had always prided myself on being a strong and resilient person, on having survived the chaos and dysfunction of my early years relatively unscathed. But now, I found myself questioning everything I had ever known about myself and my past. Had my father ever turned his sick and predatory gaze upon me, his own flesh and blood? Had he ever laid a hand on me in the same way he had my sisters, violated me in ways that no child should ever have to endure? The thought made my stomach churn and my skin crawl, but I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that there were parts of my own history that had been hidden from me, secrets that were only now beginning to claw their way to the surface. At the same time, I was consumed by an overwhelming sense of guilt for the love and affection I had once felt for my father, for the way I had looked up to him and sought his approval even as he was committing the most unspeakable acts of betrayal and abuse. How could I reconcile the man I had once known, the father who had taught me to ride a bike and tucked me in at night, with the monster who had preyed upon my sisters and shattered our family beyond repair? I felt like a traitor to my own heart, a selfish and unfeeling daughter who had somehow managed to escape the horrors that had been inflicted upon her siblings. I knew that my love for my father was a twisted and tainted thing, a sickness that had infected every aspect of my being. And yet, Even in the face of such unimaginable evil, I couldn't seem to let go of the tiny flicker of hope that still burned within me. The desperate desire for a father who could be redeemed, a family that could somehow be made whole again. But even as I struggled with my own inner turmoil, I couldn't ignore the white-hot anger that burned within me at the thought of my mother and sister's silence, at the years of secrecy and lies that had allowed my father to escape the consequences of his actions for so long. I knew that they had been trying to protect me in their own way, that they had carried the burden of their trauma alone so that I might be spared the same fate. But in that moment, all I could feel was a sense of betrayal so deep and so profound that it threatened to consume me entirely. How could they have kept something like this from me, their own sister and daughter? How could they have allowed me to live in ignorance for so long, to build a life and a family of my own without ever knowing the true depths of the darkness that had shaped our past? I felt like a fool, a naive and gullible child who had been blind to the signs that had been staring me in the face all along. And yet, even in the midst of my anger and despair, I knew that I couldn't turn my back on my family, that I had to find a way to move forward and heal the wounds that had been inflicted upon us all. I had to be strong for my children, for my husband, for the life that I had worked so hard to build. I had to find a way to confront the past and all its ugly truths, to see my family as it was rather than as I wished it could be. It would be a long and difficult journey, one that would test the very limits of my strength and resilience. But I knew that I had no choice but to keep moving forward, to keep fighting for the love and the light that I knew still existed in the world, even in the darkest and most desperate of times. As I navigated the tumultuous waters of my new reality, I found myself grappling with one of the most difficult and painful questions of my life. How could I ever forgive my father for the unspeakable crimes he had committed against my sisters, and the devastating impact his actions had on our entire family? I had always been a fierce advocate for justice, a staunch believer in the idea that those who preyed upon the innocent and vulnerable deserved to be punished to the fullest extent of the law. The thought of pedophiles walking free, of them being able to continue their sick and twisted behavior without consequence, made my blood boil and my stomach churn. And yet here I was, faced with the knowledge that my own father was one of those very monsters, a man who had used his position of trust and authority to abuse and exploit the children he was supposed to protect. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much to bear, and I found myself torn between my love for the man who had raised me and my disgust and revulsion at the heinous acts he had committed. How could I reconcile the father I had known, the one who had taught me to ride a bike and tucked me in at night, with the predator who had stolen the innocence and trust of my own sisters? How could I ever look him in the eye again, knowing the depths of his depravity and the scars he had left on our family? I wished with every fiber of my being that I could simply turn off my emotions, that I could erase the love and affection I had once felt for him, and replace it with the cold, hard reality of his crimes. But I knew that it wasn't that simple, that the bonds of family and the memories of a shared past couldn't be severed so easily. And then there were my sisters, the two women who had suffered the most at the hands of our father, and yet had somehow found the strength and courage to move forward with their lives. I watched in awe as they grappled with their own complicated feelings, as they made the difficult and deeply personal choices about how to navigate their relationships with the man who had caused them so much pain. My younger sister had chosen to maintain a limited level of contact with our father, to allow him a small measure of presence in her life, even as she kept him at a careful distance. She had found a way to forgive him, not for his sake, but for her own, to release the anger and bitterness that had once threatened to consume her, and to focus on building a better future for herself and her loved ones. My older sister, on the other hand, had cut ties with our father completely, refusing to have any contact with him whatsoever. She had made the difficult but necessary decision to prioritize her own healing and well-being, to surround herself with people who loved and supported her unconditionally. I marveled at their strength and resilience, at the way they had each found their own path to healing and forgiveness. And yet, I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt and shame at my own inability to do the same, at the way my love for my father still lingered like a stubborn weed that refused to be pulled from the garden of my heart. I knew that I needed to find my own way forward, to come to terms with the complex and contradictory emotions that swirled within me. I needed to learn to separate the man from the monster, to hold him accountable for his actions while still acknowledging the role he had played in shaping the person I had become. It would be a long and difficult journey, one that would require me to confront the darkest parts of myself and my family's history. But I knew that I had no choice but to keep moving forward, to keep fighting for the love and the light that I knew still existed in the world, even in the face of such unimaginable darkness. And so, with a sense of hope and determination burning bright within me, I set out on the path to forgiveness, knowing that it would be the hardest and most important journey of my life. As I continued to navigate the complexities of my new reality, I found myself driven by an unwavering commitment to protecting my own children from the darkness that had once consumed my family. I knew that I could never fully shield them from the pain and trauma of the past, but I was determined to do everything in my power to create a safe and nurturing environment where they could thrive and grow. This meant setting clear boundaries with my father, making it abundantly clear that he was to have no contact with my children whatsoever. I knew that I couldn't control his actions or his desires, but I could control my own response, and I was willing to do whatever it took to keep my little ones out of harm's way. At the same time, I found myself grappling with the difficult question of legal action, of whether or not to pursue criminal charges against my father for the abuse he had inflicted upon my sisters. I knew that the decision was not mine to make, that it was up to my sisters to choose their own path to justice and healing. I respected their choices, even as I struggled to understand them. I knew that the legal system could be a blunt and imperfect tool, that it often failed to deliver the kind of closure and vindication that survivors so desperately needed. And yet, I couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration and helplessness at the thought of my father walking free, of him never being held accountable for the unspeakable harm he had caused. As I wrestled with these difficult questions, I found myself seeking out the advice and support of others who had experienced similar situations. I joined online forums and support groups, connecting with people from all walks of life who had been touched by the scourge of childhood sexual abuse. I listened to their stories, marveling at the strength and resilience they displayed in the face of such unimaginable trauma. I learned from their experiences, gaining new insights and perspectives on the long and difficult road to healing and recovery. And yet, even as I found solace and guidance in these connections, I couldn't shake the surreal and disorienting nature of my own situation. There were moments when I felt like I was living in a nightmare, like the ground beneath my feet had given way and I was falling into an abyss of confusion and despair. I would catch myself staring off into space, my mind reeling with the weight of the revelations that had shattered my world. I would find myself questioning everything I had ever known, wondering how I could have been so blind to the signs that had been right in front of me all along. But even in my darkest moments, I knew that I couldn't give up, that I had to keep moving forward no matter how difficult or painful the journey might be. I had to be strong for my children, for my husband, for the life that I had worked so hard to build. And so, with a sense of determination and purpose, I set out on the long and winding road to healing, knowing that it would be a journey of a lifetime. I knew that there would be setbacks and obstacles along the way, that there would be days when the pain and the anger threatened to overwhelm me. But I also knew that I was not alone, that I had the love and support of my family and friends, of the countless survivors who had walked this path before me. I knew that together, we could find a way to reclaim our lives, to build a better and brighter future for ourselves and for generations to come. And so, with a sense of hope and resilience burning bright within me, I took the first step forward, knowing that it was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but one that I was finally ready to embark upon.